Welcome to This Explainer. Look, if you're trying to navigate the California real estate market right now, you probably have a severe case of whiplash. There is just this massive, gaping disconnect between the laws being passed up in the state capitol and the fierce reality you actually face when you're out there trying to buy a house. As a realtor, I literally see this boots-on-the-ground reality every single day. So we're going to bypass the flashy headlines, dig into the actual data, and figure out exactly why the market feels so incredibly chaotic right now, and more importantly, how you can actually navigate it. Right off the bat, we have to tackle the million-dollar question. Literally, California has passed 182 housing reforms since 2017. Let that sink in. 182. These are land use reforms specifically aimed at cutting red tape and making it easier to build more housing. So, with all that intense legislative action, why is your house hunt still an absolute nightmare? I'll tell you, as a real estate agent, this is the number one thing my clients ask me. They read about all these new laws, they expect a flood of new homes to hit the market, and then they show up to an open house on Sunday, and there is a line wrapped around the block. The sheer momentum of these state mandates has been totally staggering. The push really kicked off back in 2017, and as we rolled into the early 2020s, the legislative activity just skyrocketed. By 2024, the lawmaking peaked with 31 new housing laws passed in a single year alone. We've seen an absolute mountain of statewide legislation. But here is the hard, unavoidable truth of real estate. State laws do not instantly fix local housing pipelines. You can sign a bill into law on a Tuesday, but you absolutely cannot build an entire neighborhood by Wednesday. So, to make sense of all this chaos and figure out who actually holds the power in this market, we use a really fantastic diagnostic tool from Realtor.com called the Market Clock. The Market Clock doesn't care about politicians and it doesn't care about laws. It purely measures available inventory, how quickly homes are flying off the market at asking prices, and whether buyers or sellers are gaining leverage. It operates just like a 12-hour clock face to show us exactly who holds the upper hand in your specific neighborhood right at this exact moment. And honestly, that's the only thing that actually matters when you're sitting down to write an offer. Just think about how scattered California truly is right now. On one hand, you have San Francisco sitting at 11 o'clock on the dial. That is an early seller's market. If you're buying there, brace yourself because you're likely facing brutal bidding wars and sellers who hold all the cards. But then you look at Riverside. Riverside is sitting all the way down at 5 o'clock, firmly in early buyer's territory. Out there, buyers are comfortably negotiating, maybe asking for concessions, taking their time. They are in the exact same state, governed by the exact same 182 housing laws, but experiencing two completely different economic realities. And plotting out the other major metros reveals even more fracturing. San Jose is at 1 o'clock, marking a late seller's market. Down the coast, Los Angeles and San Diego are sitting at 2 o'clock, which is early balanced territory. Sacramento is right there with them at 2 o'clock, but what's really incredibly revealing here is that this fragmentation isn't just some weird California quirk. Nationwide, across the top 50 metros, the market clock currently spans 9 of its 12 different positions. That is the widest distribution we've seen since this data started being tracked back in 2018. Jake Krimmel, a senior economist at Realtor.com, puts this perfectly. He notes that the market clock is an at-a-glance diagnostic tool for understanding who holds the upper hand. Real estate professionals and economists rely on this metric because it measures the actual conditions you feel on the ground. You know, it measures the sweat on your brow when you're signing that contract, completely regardless of what the politicians in Sacramento are arguing about. It is a pure, unadulterated measure of leverage. Okay, so why is there such a massive disconnect between state laws and local markets? Well, the absolutely crucial point to understand is that leverage is inherently local. State governments can rewrite the building rules all day long. They can change zoning, they can get rid of parking requirements, they can streamline the approvals. But buyer and seller leverage, that is driven entirely by local dynamics. Passing a sweeping state law just doesn't magically put San Diego, Riverside, and San Jose on the same economic timeline. To see this in action, we really have to uncover what's actually driving the gears of the clock in these different cities. Up in the Bay Area, specifically San Francisco and San Jose, their shift toward a seller's market is being fueled locally by a massive AI boom and super strict return to office mandates. Tech workers are flooding back in, right? They're demanding housing near headquarters. Conversely, Riverside is moving into a buyers-friendly direction because high mortgage rates and lower immigration are weighing heavily on their local housing demand. So you see, local forces heavily trump any long-term statewide mandates. Of course, we absolutely cannot ignore the giant elephant in the room. All of this local leverage is sitting right on top of a massive, crushing national housing shortage. Right now, that shortage is estimated at over 4.03 million homes across the entire country. 4 million. This profound gap has driven up home prices practically everywhere, and it is exactly what risks pricing entire generations out of homeownership and out of the vital wealth-building power that comes right along with it. When you translate that massive national shortage down to the average Californian, the reality check is super harsh. The state's legislative analyst's office reports that only 45% of California households would likely qualify for a mortgage on a bottom-tier home in 2025. 45%. And that is down significantly from 60% just back in 2019. That means more than half the state cannot even afford a basic starter home right now. And hey, if you're looking at mid-tier homes, the standard middle-of-the-market family house, it is so much tighter. Only 23% of California households actually qualify for a mortgage on a mid-tier home today. That is a drastic, painful drop from 35% in 2019. When I sit down at the table with my clients, this is the exact brutal math we are fighting against every single day.
Now, hold on a second. You might be wondering, wait, if Riverside is a buyer's market, doesn't that mean it's affordable? Well, actually, no, not exactly. Let's consider another absolutely crucial insight from Jake Kreml. He warns that the market clock is not for saying whether a market is cheap or expensive, or if homes are affordable relative to local incomes. Leverage and affordability are two entirely different animals. A market like Riverside might be tilting toward the buyer, meaning sellers actually have to negotiate with you. But those homes can still be incredibly expensive and completely out of reach for the average earner because of high mortgage rates and crazy high baseline prices.
Which brings us to a really, really important realization. As a professional watching these markets, if we truly want to know if these pro-supply reforms are working, I always tell my clients to completely ignore the political promises, ignore the sheer number of laws passed. Instead, look directly at the actual construction pipeline. We need to be looking at permit applications, housing starts, and certificates of occupancy. Those are the tangible, real-world indicators of whether land use reform is actually translating into physical, livable homes you can buy. And when we measure that actual pipeline, the numbers tell a very different story. The state's own target is 180,000 new homes a year just to simply address the shortage. But the actual permit numbers? Well, in 2022, California saw a high of around 120,000 permits. And then by 2023, that number actually dropped to roughly 101,000 permits. So despite all 182 of those reforms, the actual pipeline of new housing is falling woefully short of the state's own targets. When you mix sky-high prices with a really sluggish construction pipeline, eventually something has to give. And it is giving. According to IRS household formation data, there is a massive, sustained outbound migration happening right now. Get this. One California resident leaves the state every 1 minute and 44 seconds. This affordability crisis is literally pushing California's housing politics far beyond its own borders as residents basically flee to find cheaper, more accessible markets. And where exactly are they going? Often, they're packing up and taking their experiences straight to places like Texas. Housing advocates like Nicole Nozick, for example, actually moved from California to Texas explicitly to warn them about the dangers of supply constraints hardening over time. And this comparison between the two states is just absolutely stunning. California has passed 182 reforms, but still struggles to build. Meanwhile, Texas, tracked by the exact same data, has passed just 13 land use reforms since 2017, but they are going so much further in actually bringing new units online and getting them built. Take Austin, Texas, as a prime example of what happens when the pipeline actually flows. Because Texas brings so many units to the market, Austin is seeing massive, undeniable relief. They've experienced 33 straight months of annual rent declines. By January 2026, the median asking rent fell 7.3% year over year. And consequently, Austin sits very comfortably at 5 o'clock on the market clock, placing it squarely in early buyer territory. In fact, the new supply in Austin has been so incredibly effective that by February 2026, rents had plummeted a staggering 18.2% below their local peak. 18.2%. That is the deepest drop among the nation's 50 largest metros. It absolutely proves that when you actually get units out of the pipeline and into the market, the leverage shifts, and prices can actually cool down. For a real estate agent, that is the absolute clearest proof possible that supply dictates leverage. So, next time you head out into the market, whether you're buying, selling, or honestly just trying to make sense of what's happening in your own neighborhood, I want you to completely shift your perspective. Stop worrying about statewide headlines touting hundreds of new housing laws. Instead, start investigating your local pipeline to see where the real leverage actually lies. Are they pouring concrete down the street, or is it all just talk? Because at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, what time is it on your local market clock, and what is your city actually building right now?